My name is Maria, and I'm 32 years old. Life hasn't been a walk in the park, not by a long shot. I've never been one to believe in fairy tales or picture-perfect endings, but deep down, I used to think I'd at least have someone by my side to share the weight of everyday life. Life, however, had other plans for me. I became a single mom in my mid-20s, raising my daughter, Lily, all on my own. She's my joy, my reason to keep going, but I'd be lying if I said it was easy. In the beginning, I tried to keep everything under control, juggling work, motherhood, and the everyday chaos of life. I thought I could handle it all without asking for help, convincing myself that I was strong enough to manage. That mindset became a part of my identity. This fierce independence, a belief that I could handle anything life threw at me. I prided myself on being the kind of woman who didn't need anyone, who could stand on her own 2 feet and face whatever came her way. But looking back now, I realize that this pride became a silent prison, trapping me in a cycle of isolation and resentment that I was too stubborn to break. At first, I coped with small things. An occasional drink at night after Lily was in bed, or zoning out in front of the TV, pretending the world outside didn't exist. It felt harmless, just tiny breaks to decompress. But those moments started becoming routines, then habits, as I sought out ways to escape the never-ending list of responsibilities and pressures. It wasn't until much later that I understood how deep I was sinking, how those small escapes were actually adding weight to the very burdens I was trying to lift. The resentment began to creep in quietly, like a shadow that stretched longer each day. I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, but I resented the life I had chosen. I loved my daughter more than anything, but part of me felt trapped, yearning for the freedom I saw others enjoying, the nights out with friends, the carefree weekends, the simplicity of living only for themselves. That envy felt ugly, and I buried it deep, hoping it would disappear. But the more I ignored it, the more it festered, like an infection spreading just beneath the surface. I didn't know it then, but this silent bitterness would soon change everything. Being a single mother was exhausting in ways I couldn't explain to others. Friends who didn't have children or family who didn't understand the depths of my struggle often said things like, "You're so strong, Maria," or "I don't know how you do it all." Those words were meant as encouragement, but I felt trapped by them. They reminded me of the role I was expected to play, a strong, independent mother who could handle anything life threw her way. So, I wore that mask proudly, even when it weighed me down more than anyone could see. Life as a single mother brought a daily struggle that was hard for anyone else to truly grasp. My mornings began in a blur of routines, getting Lily ready for school, rushing through breakfast, trying to catch a few sips of coffee while checking the clock, and juggling my own work preparations. There was always this constant sense of time slipping away from me, and the weight of it became heavier each day. But despite the exhaustion that crept in, I held it together. To everyone around me, I looked like a woman who had it all under control. I kept my head high, my shoulders squared, and managed to keep a smile on my face, even when I could feel it cracking. There's a certain kind of loneliness that comes with being a single mother. It isn't just about not having a partner around to share the duties or split the expenses. It's a loneliness that feels bone deep, a reminder every night that you're the only one carrying the load. When I put Lily to bed and walked back to my empty living room, the silence felt almost oppressive. I would sit there trying to breathe it all out to feel some kind of relief, but it was like trying to catch my breath in a storm. And as the days turned into months and then years, I realized that this loneliness wasn't just a temporary phase. It was becoming a permanent fixture in my life. My daughter Lily was everything to me. My light, my reason to keep going, but even my love for her couldn't fill that void. I often wondered if she noticed the sadness in my eyes, or if she sensed the heaviness I carried. She was so young, so innocent, with a smile that could light up a room, and I did everything I could to shield her from my struggles. I told myself I was doing a good job of it, hiding the pain, keeping up the facade of a happy, content mom. But deep down, I couldn't shake the fear that one day she would see through it all, that she would feel the weight of the burdens I tried so hard to keep hidden. As much as I loved Lily, there was this quiet envy that started to take root within me. I'd look at other women my age, some of them my friends, living lives that felt worlds apart from mine. They were free to pursue their dreams, to go on dates, to spend their weekends however they pleased. They didn't have to worry about rushing home after work or finding babysitters just to have a few hours to themselves. And while I hated to admit it, I began to envy that freedom, that sense of possibility that felt so out of reach for me. This envy wasn't something I talked about. It was something I barely even admitted to myself. It felt shameful, as if I were betraying Lily by wishing for a life outside of my role as her mother. To cope, I turned to small comforts, quiet indulgences that felt harmless at first. An extra glass of wine after Lily went to bed became 2, then 3. Watching TV late into the night became a way to numb myself, to escape the thoughts that haunted me when everything else was quiet. These small habits turned into routines, then dependencies. They became my escape, my way of avoiding the deeper truths I was afraid to confront. But every morning when I woke up to the reality of my life, the emptiness was still there, untouched by the brief distractions of the night before. Friends and family would occasionally ask if I needed help, but I always declined. Pride, maybe, or just the fear of looking weak. I didn't want anyone to know how much I was struggling. In my mind, being strong meant handling it all on my own, never showing a crack in the armor. I told myself that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that accepting support would somehow make me less of a mother, less of a woman. So I kept everyone at arm's length, wearing my independence like a badge of honor, even as it began to isolate me from the very people who might have helped lighten the load. But the isolation had a cost. The more I tried to manage everything on my own, the more the resentment and bitterness grew. I was angry, not just at the circumstances but at the world for not understanding what it took to be a single mother. I felt invisible, as if my struggles didn't matter to anyone but me. I wanted someone to see me, to acknowledge the weight I was carrying, but at the same time I was too proud to let anyone close enough to help. This contradiction created an inner storm that I couldn't escape from, no matter how much I tried. And then there were the moments of guilt, overwhelming and all-consuming. I loved my daughter more than anything, yet I couldn't help but feel trapped. This guilt gnawed at me, whispering that I was selfish for wanting more, for wishing for a life beyond my role as a mother. It told me I was failing her, that by focusing on my own loneliness and pain, I was somehow betraying the love I felt for her. But no matter how hard I tried to push these feelings away, they lingered like a shadow that followed me everywhere. These conflicting emotions, pride, resentment, guilt, and loneliness, formed a tangled web that became harder to ignore as time went on. I tried to bury them, to hide them behind a strong, resilient facade, but they were always there, just beneath the surface. And while I thought I was handling it all, the truth was that these feelings were slowly consuming me from the inside, leaving me hollow, exhausted, and in ways I couldn't even explain, deeply afraid. As days turned into years, the weight of my daily life grew heavier, pressing down on me like a stone that wouldn't budge. I learned to carry it, but the toll was there in the dark circles under my eyes, the way my body ached each morning, and the persistent tiredness that clung to me like a second skin. The worst part was that this heaviness wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a constant gnawing sense of isolation and self-doubt. But I kept moving forward, one foot in front of the other, because that's what single mothers do. We survive. We endure. We don't have the luxury of giving up. There were moments, however, when the facade would crack. Late at night, when the house was silent and Lily was asleep, I would sit alone, letting myself feel the full weight of everything I carried. In those quiet hours, the truth became harder to ignore. I was so tired of feeling alone, of carrying every responsibility by myself. My friends had tried to be there for me, but I'd built walls so high that no one could get through. I had convinced myself that no one could possibly understand, that they would judge me if they knew how much I was struggling. So I kept my guard up, even as loneliness settled into my bones like a chill that no blanket could shake off. Raising Lily was both my greatest joy and my biggest challenge. Every time she smiled, every time she wrapped her small arms around me, my heart swelled with love. But love didn't make the struggles disappear. The financial strain was relentless. Every month felt like a race against time and bills, calculating how far I could stretch each dollar. I wanted to give Lily the world, to ensure she had everything she needed, but there were so many times when I simply couldn't. Birthdays, holidays. These were supposed to be times of joy, but they became reminders of everything I couldn't provide. Guilt became my constant companion. It whispered to me, filling my mind with thoughts that I tried desperately to push away. I felt guilty for the life I couldn't give her, for the times I was too exhausted to play, for the nights when I put her to bed and collapsed on the couch, too drained to even think. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she would grow up and remember all the ways I had fallen short, if she would resent me for the things I couldn't give her. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't escape it. It was like a loop playing in my mind, feeding my fears and insecurities. This guilt wasn't just about material things. I felt guilty for the resentment that simmered beneath the surface. I never wanted to admit it, not even to myself, but there were moments when I envied my old life, the freedom I'd lost when I became a mother. I would see friends going out, posting photos of adventures and carefree nights, and I would feel a pang of something I couldn't name. It was a bitterness I hated myself for feeling, a nagging sense of unfairness that made me question my own worth as a mother. I loved Lily more than anything, yet there were times when I felt like I was drowning, suffocating in the responsibilities that had become my life. And that feeling of resentment, no matter how brief, filled me with a shame so deep that I could hardly stand to look at myself in the mirror. But I pushed it all down, burying it beneath layers of self-reliance and forced strength. I didn't allow myself to dwell on those feelings, because I was afraid of what might happen if I did. What if I fell apart? What if, by admitting to those emotions, I became someone who couldn't handle motherhood? Someone who didn't deserve to raise a child as beautiful and kind as Lily? So, I locked it all away, pretending that if I just tried hard enough I could keep it all under control. In my desperation to hold everything together, I developed routines that felt like lifelines. Every evening after Lily went to bed, I would pour myself a glass of wine. One glass turned into 2, then 3, until it became a ritual. It wasn't just about the wine. It was about the temporary escape, the brief moments when the world felt just a little lighter. It was a way to numb the feelings I was too scared to confront, a way to escape the reality that felt too heavy to bear. But the relief was always fleeting. Morning would come, and the weight would return, heavier than before. Then there was the television, the mindless hours spent watching shows that helped me disconnect from my own life. I would sit on the couch, staring at the screen, letting the stories of other people's lives distract me from my own. For a while it worked. It dulled the loneliness, the resentment, the guilt. But deep down, I knew these were just temporary fixes, band-aids on wounds that went much deeper. Each morning, when the silence of the house greeted me once again, I would feel a hollowness that no amount of distraction could fill. And then came the pride, a kind of twisted pride that kept me from reaching out to anyone. I had convinced myself that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that admitting to my struggles would make me a failure. I didn't want anyone to see the cracks in my armor, to know that I wasn't as strong as I pretended to be. So, I kept my distance, maintaining a front of independence and resilience. Even when friends offered support, I would smile and tell them I was fine, that I had everything under control. I told myself that I was protecting Lily by not letting anyone see the truth. But the truth was that my pride was isolating me, trapping me in a prison of my own making. The isolation began to eat away at me. There were days when I felt like I was invisible, like the world had forgotten about me. I would look at other people, couples walking hand in hand, families laughing together, and a wave of bitterness would wash over me. It was a bitterness I tried to ignore, but it was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. I felt like an outsider, someone who didn't belong in a world that seemed so full of connection and joy. And as much as I wanted to reach out to find a way back to that world, my pride kept me locked in place. The loneliness became a familiar ache, something I carried with me everywhere I went. It was there in the mornings as I packed Lily's lunch, in the afternoons as I worked, and in the evenings as I watched her sleep. It was a part of me, a shadow that followed me through every moment of my life. I had learned to live with it, to accept it as a part of who I was. But there were moments, quiet moments, when I would catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and I would see someone I barely recognized. a woman worn down, struggling beneath the weight of her own expectations and fears. In those moments, I would wonder if this was it, if this was all my life would ever be. The thought was terrifying, but I couldn't shake it. It haunted me, filling me with a sense of despair that I couldn't escape. I was so tired of pretending, of holding everything together, of being the strong, independent woman everyone expected me to be. I wanted to let go, to release the burden, but I didn't know how. As time went on, my emotional walls grew thicker, and the rituals I relied on became more like chains. Each evening after I put Lily to bed, I felt the familiar pull toward the kitchen, where the wine bottle waited, almost like an old friend. Pouring that first glass felt like a release, a moment when I could let go of the tension that had built up throughout the day. But as the nights wore on, one glass turned into two, then three. The routine became predictable, even comforting in its own twisted way. I began to look forward to it as my own little escape, a reward for making it through another day. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a reward. It was a crutch, something to numb the sharp edges of my life rather than deal with them. I told myself I had it under control. After all, I wasn't drinking during the day. And I wasn't neglecting Lily. I was still doing everything I needed to do. Packing her lunches, taking her to school, going to work. I convinced myself that this habit was harmless, that it was just my way of unwinding. But somewhere along the way, I realized I was lying to myself. The lines between relaxation and dependence blurred, and I could feel it seeping into my life in ways I didn't want to admit. I started to wake up with a heaviness in my chest, an unshakable feeling of dread that lingered even in the light of day. Each morning, I'd wake up to the faint smell of last night's wine, and I'd feel a pang of shame, though I quickly pushed it aside. There was no time to dwell on it. I had to get Lily ready, get myself ready, and dive into another day. But that shame became a constant undercurrent, a reminder of the choices I was making, the ways I was letting myself down. I began to wonder if Lily could sense it. Kids have a way of picking up on things adults try to hide, and sometimes I'd catch her watching me with a curious, almost knowing look. It scared me, that look, like she could see straight through me to the cracks I tried so hard to conceal. But it wasn't just the wine. Over time, I had started to pull away from the few close friends I had. I ignored calls, declined invitations, and found reasons not to join them for coffee or a quick chat. In the beginning, I told myself it was because I was too busy, that I had too much on my plate. But the truth was, I was isolating myself because I didn't want anyone to see what was happening to me. I was terrified that they would notice the exhaustion in my eyes, the slight tremor in my hands, or the heaviness in my voice. I was afraid they would see the woman behind the mask, the woman who was barely holding it together. Eventually, even my relationship with Lily started to feel strained. She was such a bright, loving child, always eager to share her stories with me, always seeking my attention and approval. But there were days when I felt so drained, so hollow, that I could barely muster the energy to listen. I'd find myself nodding along absent-mindedly as she talked, my mind elsewhere, wrapped in my own worries. Sometimes I'd catch myself snapping at her over small things. Her toys left scattered on the floor, her insistence on one more story before bed. In those moments, the guilt hit me like a tidal wave, overwhelming and suffocating. I loved her more than anything in the world, but there were times when I felt like I was failing her, like I wasn't the mother she deserved. These thoughts haunted me, but I kept pushing them aside, burying them beneath my daily routines. The more I ignored them, the louder they became, a constant background noise that I couldn't silence. My pride wouldn't allow me to admit that I needed help, that I was struggling. I was so wrapped up in my identity as a strong, independent mother, that the idea of showing vulnerability felt like a betrayal. I didn't want anyone to see the cracks in my armor, to know that I wasn't as resilient as I pretended to be. One night, after Lily had fallen asleep, I found myself sitting alone in the dark, feeling the full weight of my life pressing down on me. I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally and mentally. The weight of it all felt unbearable, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit that I couldn't keep going like this. I was drowning in my own silence, in the isolation I had created, and I didn't know how to pull myself out. I sat there, staring into the darkness, and for the first time I let the tears come. I cried for everything I had lost, for the dreams I had abandoned, for the woman I used to be before life had worn me down. I cried for the mother I wanted to be for Lily, the mother I felt I was failing to become. I cried for the loneliness that had become my constant companion, for the pride that kept me locked away from the people who might have helped me. It was a release, a moment of raw honesty with myself that I hadn't allowed in years. In the silence that followed, I felt a strange sense of calm. The tears had stripped away the layers of pride and pretense, leaving me vulnerable, exposed. It was terrifying, but it was also a relief. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that I didn't have to do this alone. That maybe, just maybe, asking for help didn't make me weak. That admitting to my struggles didn't make me a failure. But old habits die hard, and as the days went on, I found myself slipping back into the same routines. The wine, the isolation, the late nights spent watching TV instead of facing the silence. I knew I was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering dangerously close to a breaking point, but I was still too afraid to let go of the identity I had built around myself. I was Maria, the single mother who could handle anything. To admit that I was struggling felt like admitting that I had failed. The guilt and shame continued to build, creating a storm within me that I couldn't ignore. I was constantly on edge, always waiting for something to break. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to reach out to ask for help. I was trapped in a cycle of pride and fear, unable to escape the prison I had created for myself. As much as I tried to pretend otherwise, I knew I couldn't go on like this forever. The weight was too much, the loneliness too deep, the guilt too consuming. I was a mother, but I was also a woman, a person with dreams, fears, and vulnerabilities. And in my desperate attempt to hide those vulnerabilities, I had lost sight of who I was. Another evening found me sitting alone, the glass of wine untouched in front of me. The weight of everything I'd been avoiding, hiding, and denying started to feel overwhelming. I'd become so used to carrying it all, masking my exhaustion, and pushing through each day that I'd lost sight of myself completely. Looking around my quiet living room, I felt an ache deep inside, a longing not just for company, but for something more, something I hadn't let myself consider for a long time: peace. I'd been holding on to the idea that being strong meant carrying every burden alone, that reaching out would only confirm my failures. But now I was starting to see that maybe this pride, this stubborn independence, was the real source of my pain. I realized I had locked myself into a life of isolation, all because I was afraid to be seen as weak, afraid to admit that I was struggling. It was a hard truth, and it felt like a betrayal to even think about letting go of this identity I'd built. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I'd reached a point where the loneliness, the endless cycle of guilt and resentment, was breaking me down piece by piece. And that night I made a quiet, tentative promise to myself, to start looking for a way out, to stop pretending that I was fine, and to finally confront the fears that had kept me locked away for so long. As the days passed, that quiet promise I'd made to myself took root in small, almost imperceptible ways. I started by allowing myself brief moments of honesty, acknowledging the feelings I'd tried to bury for so long. It wasn't easy. Each emotion, resentment, loneliness, guilt, seemed to rise like waves, and I'd feel myself tensing, wanting to push it all back down. But each time I reminded myself of my promise, breathing deeply and letting those feelings come. I was finally, slowly, beginning to confront the inner storm I'd avoided for years. One night, as I lay awake in bed, the memory of my last true friendship came flooding back. Sarah had been my closest confidant, the one person who had seen my journey into motherhood from the beginning. We'd lost touch over the years, mostly because I'd pushed her away, convinced that my struggles were something only I could handle. That night I picked up my phone, hesitated, and finally typed a message to her. It was a simple, almost cautious reach out, but to my surprise, she responded almost immediately. "I'm here," she wrote, "whenever you need to talk." Our conversation that night became a lifeline. She listened without judgment, her voice warm and understanding, reminding me of the strength that comes not from isolation, but from connection. Sharing my struggles felt both terrifying and freeing, like I was tearing down walls I'd built too high. As I spoke, the weight I'd carried alone for so long started to feel lighter, shared, even if only for a moment. It was the first real step toward healing, and it reminded me that I didn't have to do this alone. In the days that followed, I started noticing the small ways my openness affected my life. Instead of rushing through my days on autopilot, I slowed down, taking moments to simply be present with Lily. Her laughter, her stories, things I had once been too exhausted to fully engage with, became my reminders of why I was fighting so hard. I began to see her not as another weight to carry, but as a source of joy and resilience, a part of me that I wanted to nurture and protect. I still felt moments of guilt and doubt, but they no longer consumed me. I was learning to forgive myself, to recognize that being a good mother didn't mean being perfect. Then came a pivotal moment. I was out at a local community center, having signed Lily up for a weekend activity that gave us both a break. As she played with other kids, I found myself in a conversation with a group of mothers. Initially, I felt the familiar impulse to hide my struggles, to paint a picture of strength and resilience. But something in me shifted, and for the first time I allowed myself to be vulnerable. I shared a bit of my story, my challenges as a single mother, and to my surprise, they responded with empathy and understanding. Each of them shared a piece of their own lives, and in that moment, I felt a connection that I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't alone in my journey. There were others who understood. This newfound sense of connection began to ripple out in ways I hadn't anticipated. Inspired by the conversations at the community center, I decided to start a small support group for single mothers. It was a space where we could share our stories, our struggles, and our victories. As the weeks went by, I watched our group grow, not just in numbers but in strength and solidarity. Each of us came from different backgrounds and faced unique challenges, but we found common ground in our shared experiences. Together we laughed, we cried, and we found strength in one another. My pride, once an unyielding barrier, had become a bridge, allowing me to connect with others in ways I had never thought possible. Through these experiences, I discovered a profound sense of purpose. The pain and isolation I had felt weren't in vain. They had led me to a place where I could offer compassion and understanding to others who were struggling. I began volunteering at the community center, offering support to new mothers, sharing my journey, and helping them navigate the challenges of single parenthood. For the first time in years, I felt like I was giving back, turning my hardships into a force for good. My relationship with Lily flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. She saw the change in me, and our bond grew stronger. I found myself not only teaching her but learning from her, about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of vulnerability. Together we created new routines, filling our days with laughter and connection. I stopped leaning on the temporary escapes that once held me, and instead I found peace in the present, in the simple, everyday moments that I had once overlooked. As I look back now, I see my journey not as a series of struggles, but as a path that led me toward understanding and self-acceptance. I am not the same person I was. The pain, the loneliness, the guilt, they were all pieces of a story that ultimately shaped me into a stronger, more compassionate version of myself. I no longer carry the weight of perfection on my shoulders. Instead, I carry a sense of purpose, a commitment to support others as they navigate their own challenges. In the end, I discovered that strength isn't about enduring life alone. It's about opening up, allowing others in, and finding courage in connection. I am still Maria, still a single mother, but I am no longer defined by isolation. I am defined by resilience, by hope, and by a love that has deepened in ways I could have never imagined. If I could sit down with every single mother who feels like I once did, I'd tell her this: don't believe the lie that you have to do it all alone. I know what it's like to carry that weight, to feel like reaching out means admitting failure. But I'm here to tell you that strength isn't about how much you can carry on your own. It's about how willing you are to open yourself up to others, to let someone in. The real courage lies in allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to admit that sometimes it's all just too much. When you're a single mother, it's easy to lose yourself in the responsibilities, the daily grind, the constant pressure to be everything for your child. But remember, you're more than a mother. You're a person with dreams, with needs, with your own heart that deserves just as much care as the love you give to everyone else. Don't forget that taking care of yourself is not selfish. It's necessary. Your well-being is the foundation upon which everything else rests. I'd remind you that loneliness is a silent enemy, one that creeps into your heart and tries to convince you that no one understands. But the truth is, there are people out there who do understand, who want to support you, who want to hear your story. You don't have to go through life hiding behind a mask, pretending that everything is fine when it isn't. Opening up can feel like standing on the edge of a cliff, but when you take that leap, you'll find others ready to catch you, to lift you up. Be gentle with yourself. There will be days when it all feels overwhelming, when the weight of it seems impossible to bear. In those moments, remember that it's okay to take things one day at a time, one moment at a time if you need to. Let go of the pressure to be perfect. Perfection isn't what your child needs. What they need is a mother who's present, who's real, who's doing her best. And your best is enough. It's more than enough. Finally, don't lose sight of joy. It's easy to become so consumed by responsibilities that you forget to live, to laugh, to feel the warmth of a sunny day or the beauty of a quiet evening. Find those little moments, the ones that make you feel alive, and hold on to them. They're the moments that remind you of why you're here, of all the love that exists even on the hardest days. If you feel isolated, reach out. If you feel broken, allow yourself to heal. If you feel lost, remember that you're not alone in this journey. Your story, with all its struggles and triumphs, is a testament to your strength. Embrace it, own it, and know that every step you take, even the smallest one, is a step forward. You are seen, you are valued, and you are never, ever alone.